Hi, I'm Dr. Mollie Marti, and welcome to Resiliency Matters. Today we are speaking with Dr. Sally Spencer-Thomas, a clinical psychologist and social impact entrepreneur. She is on a mission to save lives and is innovating the field of mental health. Welcome, Sally.
Molly, it's an honor to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
So your life, your career really is marked as a before and after of your brother Carsons' death by suicide. Talk about how this has impacted your work.
Yeah. So I was a psychologist or involved in some kind of mental health services for about 16 years before my younger brother and only sibling took his life in 2004. My brother, by a lot of external accounts, was, very successful, seemed happy, was loved by a lot of friends. But right alongside that, he really fought hard against depression, a depression that ultimately proved to be fatal. So, in the experience after his death, in our acute grief, our family and his friends, we pulled together to find bold, gap filling ways to prevent what happened to Carson from happening to other people. And it's really been a huge passion at work to try to make meaning out of this devastating loss.
So you seek to create an honest and open discourse about suicide, mental health, topics that a lot of people find uncomfortable. How do we get better at talking about these subjects?
Well, the first thing we need to do is to acknowledge that everybody has mental health. Some people have it harder, and we all take our turns with things in our life that just bring us to our knees. Nobody gets out of this life without having an experience, at least one, if not many, that are incredibly overwhelming. So the first part is to really be humble and acknowledge that we're all in this together, and that each and every one of us, if not directly, somebody very close to us will be going through this. The other thing that's really important to know is that as we're moving forward in the work and evolving what we're doing in mental health, we're learning more and more about the power of storytelling. Storytelling, politicians have known about this for years, business leaders, religious leaders, that story is the way to the heart, and it's also the way to cultural and social change. For the history of mental health, we've been taught to keep our stories private, and with that came some shame. But now people are coming out proud. And so one of the organizations that I'm involved in, United Suicide Survivors International, we work really hard to help people share their stories safely and effectively and lift up their voices of living through some kind of suicide crisis, coming out proud and being a model that there are ways through this.
So you do a lot to integrate the research on meaning making and storytelling, and it really is coming out more and more, not just field work, but research based. Talk a little bit more about what this looks like.
Yeah. So again, I'm super inspired by the brain science and the data behind this storytelling work. There's a whole field called narrative psychology that has been working with people for a long time in narrative therapy to help people hone their stories. Whenever we experience something that's traumatic or very overwhelming, like a suicide crisis, it's easy to feel scrambled inside because those memories are like crumpled up pieces of paper. So what stories do for us is they create a beginning and a middle and an end, and helps us organize our memories and feelings in a way that's processed in a way that just feels a little bit more contained. And rather than influencing us, we are the ones who are in charge of that story. The other thing that's important to know is that stories have a huge impact on listeners. That when people hear a very powerful and well crafted story, they have chemical changes that increase empathy, compassion, and focus. And then we also know that when enough people tell their story, we have a chance to change culture by telling a more powerful tale.
I find that so fascinating, and we're doing more and more work in this area as well of the power of the stories you're talking about within a treatment and post-traumatic work and growth, all the way up to changing cultures. So it's a very
Exactly.
powerful modality.
Exactly.
You also work in a specialty area of helping working age men who fight challenges around telling their story, around talking about and seeking help. Tell us about this.
Yeah. So one of the first things that I learned after my brother's death, and again, I had great training. Went to the University of Denver, did an internship at the Boston VA Medical Center. I had great mentors, but nobody ever told me some of these things. And one of the things that I didn't know was that the majority of people who die by suicide are men. About 80% are male, and most of them are working aged men. And most of them have never, not once, reached out to a mental health service provider. They have one suicide attempt and it's fatal. So that seemed like a really important gap to fill. So, about the time that I was figuring this out, our state in Colorado was looking at their data and figuring it out there. And we also connected with another partner. Cactus is a full service advertising agency. And together, we put our heads together and we thought, we need to listen to these men and figure out how we're missing the boat and what would help them. So we spent about 18 months just doing focus groups and in-depth interviews and surveying all kinds of men, especially men who had attempted suicide and had survived, and asked them, like, what would have helped you? What would you have needed? And it's a much longer thing that I can cover today. But the upshot of that work was the creation of a resource called Man Therapy, mantherapy.org. And what makes it innovative is that it uses humor and digital media to draw men in who might not usually come to the conversation. And once they get to the website portal, mantherapy.org, they are greeted by a fictitious therapist called Dr. Rich Mahogany, who uses his humor to engage them and to take a self-screening tool where they can see how bad is it for depression, anxiety, substance use, and anger. And then from there, they can get resources that match their problem. So it's a really, really cool thing. And then also we've cultivated a whole village of storytellers. We are involved in a men's anthology series called Guts, Grit, and the Grind. Guts, Grit, and the Grind. And really it's about sharing men's stories of coming through addiction and trauma and suicide and depression. And they are powerful heroes' journeys that are very inspiring.
So what are some of these subsets within these men we talk about that are challenged in seeking help? Because I'm thinking across, military or construction workers or farmers. I'm a Midwest girl, and we know the high rates of suicide in those groups. Speak to some of these kind of subsectors across this working age men group.
Yeah, so that was another aha moment early on where we thought, well, if we're reaching youth around suicide prevention and mental health promotion through the school system, we should be able to reach working aged men or working aged people. I'll also just make sure everybody knows that while men are dying more by suicide, women are attempting more. So it is both men and women that need support. That the workplace seemed like the logical place to do some kind of comprehensive and sustained strategy. And when we first started developing trainings around this and strategies back in 2007, we were just banging our head against the wall. Workplace leaders would come back to us and say, this is not a workplace issue, it's a medical issue. And we would say, yeah, but they're not showing up at their medical provider and they're working. There are many people right here who are experiencing suicidal thoughts and maybe even suicidal behavior who are not reaching out. So maybe you could help. And that just went nowhere for quite a while until we started getting data from the CDC around 2016, and then everything changed. So there's been a group of us that have been diligently and perseveringly trying to get people enrolled in this work. And last year, 2019, we launched national guidelines for workplace suicide prevention, where we can kind of give employers and professional associations some handholds on how to take steps into making their work environment safer from suicide. We also have specific resources for construction, because pretty consistently construction comes up in top 1 or 2 industries for suicide rates. So we've developed Construction Working Minds as a place for construction leaders and unions and other professional associations to get resources and training and all kinds of other things to help their workers.
Excellent. And we'll put some of those resources and links, share them with our audience. But I just want to emphasize and welcome you to add anything else. This is a really important point, that we are at a place in the progress that we're shifting this conversation beyond mental health or suicide prevention, which, again, a lot of people don't want to touch with a 10-foot pole. They're not comfortable, to really a vibrant workplace health and safety issue discussion.
Yeah, I
think what you want to say about that.
Yeah, whatever gets us in the door is great. If we have to talk about it as workplace well-being, if that's the easier door to open, that's great. And I'll also say you can't shy away from the hard stuff, because if you don't talk directly about mental health and suicide, then it still remains invisible. So I always say both and. We have to address upstream things like making it a safe place to work psychologically and bolstering up resilience. And all of those things are really important. And if we get that right, we're going to eliminate a lot of despair. And still, just like other health issues, we can do a lot of preventative work well, and we're still going to get people that are suffering. So we also have to be prepared for how to help somebody through their darkest day and to say the word suicide out loud and directly. And so that's what we coach workplaces to do.
Excellent. Speaking of dark days, we are taping this as a pandemic special. We are a year into the pandemic and continuing on. So we are hosting the show at a time where a lot of people are struggling to cope with the adversity and challenges they have in their life, along with the isolation and additional mental health demands. What advice would you share with our viewers who need some support in coping?
Yeah, and you just totally addressed it. This is a perfect storm of all the things that we know put people at risk for suicide, not just the isolation and, for many people, the tremendous anxiety about the uncertainty of our future, the virus, the employment situation, all kinds of things up in the air. But we also have seen great fluctuations in job stability and financial stability and drug and alcohol use and firearm purchasing, and all kinds of things are pointing us in a direction to be very concerned at this point in time. So again, to prepare for that, knowing that the hardship is a reality for most of us, or it'll ebb and flow and will hit us eventually, we need to be prepared. And so one of the things that is very helpful is that if you start your day off with some rituals that give you a fighting chance to be grounded and calm as these waves of news and disruptions continue to hit us. So some of the things that work for some people, and I would encourage you to try a bunch of them because not everything works for everybody, but try things like journaling around gratitude. And I'm not just talking about the big things like health and family, but also small things like, I'm really grateful for my fuzzy slippers today because they're keeping my feet warm, or the warm soup I had for lunch because it really nourished me, or the way my cat brushes up against me with her soft fur. Those kinds of things, when we start to wire our brain to look for gratitude, our brain starts to seek it on its own, and then we have a different perspective. Things that are grounding, like meditation and yoga, are also great. Putting your exercise routine in the first thing in the morning kind of helps you regulate some of those stress chemicals. Whatever it is, whatever works for you, get those and be religious about practicing them so that you can have a shot at it. The other thing to do is knowing that the chances are good that at some point we're going to have some more crises happen, that you have a plan for managing your own and your loved one's crises. Just like we put a plan together to evacuate from a burning building, we need a plan to help ourselves and our loved ones get out of an emotional crisis. And again, it's a larger conversation than I can have today, but it involves things like knowing what coping strategies help reduce your alarm bells, as we like to call it, when you're really revved up, knowing who are the 5 people that you can call that'll, come to your side no matter what kind of day or night it is, and knowing what the resources are at your fingertips for crisis, for mental health resources, and having them vetted before you find yourself in a crisis.
Excellent advice. We will talk more about coping strategies and Sally's personal journey through loss and grief and recovery when we come back.
Today, more than ever, you need fast, reliable internet. At Mediacom, we want you to know you can count on us. Our fiber-powered 100% gigabit technology network was built for the future. We have enormous capacity and power, and 99.99% network reliability. So even though these are uncertain times, we're prepared, and you can be certain we'll keep your world connected.
As the nation's doctor, I often get asked, what should I do if I think I might have coronavirus?
People who are sick should stay home. You don't go to an emergency room, you don't go to a clinic. You get on the phone and you ask for advice and instructions from your physician.
We don't want you to go into the ER or the doctor's office without talking to them first, because you might spread coronavirus to someone else. Please visit coronavirus.gov for more information.
Have you heard about social distancing?
This is very serious. We have to stay home.
Not just to protect yourself, but to protect others.
You don't want to spread the coronavirus in your community.
Stay at least 6 feet away from other people. 2, arm's length.
Staying home helps lower the risk for everyone.
Protect your life, protect your loved ones, and protect the world.
Just because you're at home
doesn't mean that we can't be alone together.
Together.
Hi, I'm Dr. Mollie Marti, and welcome back to Resiliency Matters. Today we are speaking with Dr. Sally Spencer-Thomas about mental health, suicide prevention, and really innovating this area to help more people. So Sally, we left off where you were talking about a mental health safety plan. And what we know is that the more strategies you have, the better. The bigger the toolbox, the better, because it's not about one specific strategy works for all these people, but really using the right strategy at the right time to stabilize and move forward. So a couple things I want to explore there. And one is the role of distraction as a coping skill. We find that sometimes people are really surprised that distraction can be a healthy coping skill. Can you talk about this?
Sure. So in the long run, constantly distracting is not always helpful. But in the short run, when people are overwhelmed and doing what we call rumination, which means basically their mind has turned into a skipping record where they can't get their thoughts off something that's very distressing or upsetting, then distraction can be a really helpful tool. So the idea there is to stop the record skipping by going and doing something that is incompatible with that kind of thought. So watching video games, or go take a walk around the block and count birds, or just something that starts your attention focused on something else for a period of time. The more compelling the distraction, the better. So a really engrossing movie or video game usually can do the trick and just kind of gets you over the hump of that really intense emotional experience.
And also, there's a lot of ways to approach regulation and, within your window tolerance of Dr. Dan Siegel, or other ways to re-regulate. And I know you have tools. And so would you share a bit about that?
Sure. And I'll highlight one of my favorite that many people don't know about, and it's super effective. So this is an emotional regulation hack called the mammalian dive reflex. Now I know your viewers are like, what the heck is she saying? Mammalian, i.e. mammal, diving into cold water, reflex, mammalian diving reflex. You can look it up. It's a thing. So the gist is this, and you've all experienced this. If you've ever dove into a really cold lake or pool or got into a really cold shower, you have kind of a shock experience, right? It feels really uncomfortable for a minute or two, and then you get out and you feel like $1,000,000. That's because our what we call parasympathetic nervous system has kicked in. And this reflex came as a way to protect us from drowning, of all things. Because as soon as somebody falls into cold water, this reflex kicks in and it slows down our breathing and slows down our heart rate so that potentially we would survive a drowning. This is why people who fall into the lake and are rescued later and recover, this is because of this reflex. So you can stimulate this by putting your body, or more likely your face, into really cold water. I know it sounds weird, but it really, really works. So if you're feeling overwhelmed by your emotions, go take a really cold shower and stick your face right under that faucet so that you can get that full sensation. Or go into the kitchen and put ice in a bowl with some water and submerge your face for about 30 seconds. I promise you, when you're done, you will feel much more in control of your emotions.
Excellent. That might be one of my favorite quotes by a guest so far. You can look it up. It's a thing. I like that. So you lost your brother Carson, as we talked about, to suicide. And I'm really curious, and it will benefit our viewers, for you to share more about your personal story of grief and healing.
Yeah. So Carson died December 7th, 2004. It was 2 weeks before his 35th birthday, which was also 2 weeks before Christmas. He was born on Christmas Eve, and he's my earliest memory. My parents told me he was my Christmas gift, and I took that really seriously. And on that year, it was also 2 weeks before the Asian tsunami hit. And for those of you who can recall back to that time, it was a pretty devastating international disaster. And it was months later that when I looked back on our family's experience in the aftermath of my brother's death, how much our experience mirrored the international response to that disaster. the first couple of weeks were completely like drowning. Night and day was on its head, like all of the usual rituals of our day, like eating and sleeping and doing things, like nothing made sense. One of my strongest symptoms during that time was an overwhelming sense of fear, because it was such a strong trauma for me that all my assumptions of how the world is supposed to work was shattered. And so everything became dangerous. And it turns out if you think everything's dangerous, it's really hard to get through your day. I would be driving out to the airport to go pick up people who were coming into town to go to his memorial service, and I would be what we call dissociated. I would be out of my body, and all of a sudden I would come to and realize I was driving 80 miles an hour, and I had no idea where I was going. It was a very, very surreal and upsetting thing to happen. Once we got past this kind of initial shock and hugely traumatic phase, then the next part was like you had at some point to resurface from that and look around the landscape, and everything was different. Everything was moved. Nothing was in the place it was supposed to be. And by that, I mean, on January 3rd, I had to go back to work, and I used to love my job. I really enjoyed it. I was working at a university at the time, and I remember going back on campus and feeling like, I don't care about any of this stuff. How does this even matter? Like, I couldn't get motivated. Luckily for me, I had some really great colleagues, and they were very flexible with me as I went through the grief process. Similarly, ripple effects through space and time. It was in the early days of social media. So very quickly, people around the US learned of my brother's death, and just then dealing with their trauma reactions just felt like wave after wave of that. And then the aftershocks, some of them predictable, like all of the birthdays and anniversaries, and some of them really unpredictable. And it was often the ones that kind of caught us off guard, like finding a picture we thought we lost, or discovering something of his that he left under a bed. Those were really, really hard to deal with. And just like in the tsunami metaphor, it took a number of special teams to get us back on track. Friends and family, for sure. I sought a grief counselor. I went to a support group for other families that had lost someone to suicide. That actually, for me, was probably the most helpful. Had impacts on my health that I had needed to manage, and so on. So it took a lot, and it took a long time. This is another thing I want to say to all the people who are bereaved by suicide, that this is a very complicated form of bereavement for most of us. You have both grief and trauma, which makes it a push-pull experience. You've got a world around you that often doesn't understand this kind of loss and makes judgments. There's a lot to work through, but you can get there, especially when you surround yourself with other people who've paved the path before you.
Thank you for sharing that. As with everything you do, you're forthright that your healing and resilience has included a spiritual component. And as a researcher, you've also delved into this a bit. Can you speak to this?
Yeah. So spirituality means different things to different people. For some people, it's about participating in their faith community. And as one of the special teams that I didn't mention, my faith community at the time did all the right things. And I'm really lucky, because sometimes faith communities make it worse with some of the things that they say and do or not do. But mine got it right. And so one of the papers that I wrote, actually, again, years later, was about their case study of understanding how to support people who are bereaved by suicide, and also turn the energy of that lived experience through suicide and mental health into our internal community's advocacy for well-being, as well as our engagement in the broader Denver metro area. So that's one of the pieces of research. I did a qualitative study on all of the stakeholders in my faith community and their work in this space. For some people, it's about nature or about social justice. Some folks find their spirituality through the arts and so forth, and so have contributed to some efforts there. We wrote a kind of a guidebook for faith leaders back in the early days, when I was about like 2010, 2011, helping faith leaders find their way and guiding people through suicide prevention, intervention, and crisis response. But probably the thing I'm most excited to share was what I call my ghost stories research. So it wasn't long after Carson died that I and others in our family had these very powerful sense of presence experiences. And I remember when I first had it, I thought to myself, I'm never sharing this with anybody. I'm totally losing my marbles. And then little by little, I started to hear whispers in support groups about other people who had really intense and powerful, meaningful dreams or coincidences they just couldn't explain. And all of these things kind of lose their power in translation. But I started to notice like other people were having these too. So I partnered up with a real researcher, Dr. Danielle Jean. I'm just a fake one. I play one on TV, but she's the real deal. And I said, Danielle, wouldn't it be cool if we kind of looked into this and see how people experience these things and how they make meaning out of them? And I'm so grateful that she said yes, because she could have totally thought that I was off my rocker, but she said yes. And so we cast out a survey to the world, and 1,700 plus responses later, we have one of the largest data sets of people bereaved by suicide. And we asked them, have you had these other kind of continuing bond, sense of presence moments with your loved one who died by suicide? And about 80% of the people who responded said yes. And then we asked, were they helpful? Were they not helpful? Was it neutral? And again, about 80% of the people who experienced them said, yes, they were helpful. The majority of the rest of them said they were a mixed bag. They brought up a lot of grief, but they were also help people make meaning, forgiveness, knowing that their loved one was at peace, feeling love even through the veil kind of thing. And so now we've published this data set in 2 peer-reviewed journal articles and an academic chapter in a suicide grief international guidebook. And it's not to say, are these things real, right? Because I think there's some mysteries in life that we're just never supposed to fully understand. But it's more, do people experience these things, and how does it help them or not in their grief journey was really the point we were trying to make.
Excellent. Before we wrap up here, I want to ask you one final question. You are a marathoner, veteran marathoner, and you talk about this mile 17, and I think this is a great ending point for us with our viewers. What does mile 17 mean to you?
Sure. So first of all, I want to get it clear to all of your viewers that I am just a wannabe athlete. I am struggling in the back of the pack, but for me, marathoning is a spiritual quest and keeps me honest with my day-to-day training. And then for those of you who have run long distances, there's usually this point in time where you just hit a wall and it just doesn't feel like you're going to make it, because it's just so hard. Every step is painful. You get into this really dark place in your head. And for me, getting through mile 17, if I could get through that, then I knew I was probably going to finish. So I found ways to kind of cope with that mile, because you're all the way in, you're 17 miles in, but you have so many more miles to go. Is really just to focus on that one step, and then the next step, and then the next step, and then draw energy from all the people around you. All of us in the back of the pack, we all have stories to share. So listening to each other's stories and pulling energy from the crowd really has become a metaphor for me for how to get through really hard times. Just break it down to one step, the smallest mile markers you could get, and then really lean on other people.
That is an excellent place to stop, one step at a time, and remembering we thrive together. Thank you so much for this conversation, Sally. And thank you, viewers, for joining us on MediaCom MC22, your local programming leader.